Hi, everyone. As we start to load up individuals here into today's session, apologize for the late delay, some technical difficulties on my end, so I appreciate everybody's patience. So before I get going here, I know that the individuals that we have joining us today already know a little bit about the Estes Valley Watershed Coalition, but I'm just going to go ahead and introduce our group, introducing myself, and then I'll introduce the speakers that we've got going on for today. So I would first like to say welcome once again, and a little bit of information about the Estes Valley Watershed Coalition. We actually have a board group of approximately 12 now, and my name is Dawn Andrews, and I am the Vice President and Treasurer of the Estes Valley Watershed Coalition. We have several board members on this call today as well. Just a reminder, we are recording today's session, so if you don't want your lovely face to be included in the session, just go ahead and take off your video, just kind of turn off your video camera there. But if you don't mind, and it doesn't matter to you, then great, just leave it as is. But just a little bit about us. We are actually an organization that started in 2015, and we actually formed to help coordinate and implement the flood restoration projects, allowing the community here to really recover from the 2013 flood. And we're actively working on healthy forest and watershed restoration projects in the Estes Valley, and working with a lot of different organizations such as Northern Water and other agencies and helping us to restore the areas around our town. We also formed an organization called Wandering Wildlife Society, and this is actually part of our talks today, is having a story about water in the Estes Park area. So the Wandering Wildlife Society, we put on a lot of wildlife talks, a lot of environmental outreach discussions. So I would encourage you to participate going in the future on many of our calls. Feel free to join our website, follow us along on Facebook. We have an events page that you can actually go and understand what events are coming up and what talks are coming up as well. So I appreciate that. Now, with no further delay here, let me introduce to you our speakers. And by the way, happy Earth Day. It is Earth Day today, April 22nd, but the Estes Valley Watershed Coalition, we're supporting Earth Day all month. And so this is one of our talks. So Kimberly Mihelich is part of the Northern Water Organization. She is a source water protection specialist, and it's a public agency that works with the Bureau of Reclamation to provide water to the east slope of the Continental Divide. She and her colleague Amanda Simmons from the Colorado Rural Water Association will be discussing today the routes that waters take to serve Estes Park and downstream communities, and of course the threats of climate change on this critical resource. So I'm going to just stop talking here. I am going to unshare my slides, and I'm going to let Kimberly and Amanda take over and share a little bit of information about what we've got going on all around us with respect to water. So take it away.
All right, thanks so much, Dawn. Thanks for that great introduction. I'm going to share my screen now, and hopefully you can see that.
Yes, we can.
Okay, I'm going to put it into presenter mode, and can you see the presenter slide rather than the notes slide?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. Okay, well, thanks everyone. Good afternoon. I'm happy to be here, and I think Amanda's happy to be here. We're excited to talk to you about how water gets to Estes Park. And we're also going to talk a lot about wildfire, because that's kind of the big subject that has been on our minds recently, and probably on a lot of your minds as well. So I'm going to start out just quickly talking about where our water comes from, and I'll focus on the Colorado Big Thompson project, which is what Northern Water helps manage. And then Amanda's going to talk about the town of Estes Park, in particular, their drinking water sources. And then we'll follow that with just a really brief overview of the 2020 wildfire season and what those impacts may be to drinking water supplies and then we will just end on what we're doing in particular with recovery from the East Troublesome Fire. And I guess I should have introduced myself. I know Don did a great introduction, but I'm Kimberly Mihelich and I'm with Northern Water. So just to begin, the Colorado Big Thompson project is where a lot of the town of Estes Park and the Estes Valley water supply begins. So Northern Colorado Water Conservancy District, or Northern Water, which is who I work for, we're a raw water provider. We provide raw water supply to more than 1 million people and over 600,000 irrigated acres in northeastern Colorado. We were created in the 1930s to jointly operate and maintain the federally owned Colorado Big Thompson project with the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation. So the CBT project collects supplemental water west of the Continental Divide and delivers it to the Northern Front Range. In the 1970s, Northern Water created a municipal subdistrict along with 6 Front Range municipalities to build the Windy Gap project. And that will soon begin construction of Chimney Hollow Reservoir near Loveland. So that'll just bring additional supplemental water to drinking water suppliers. And then in addition to the original CBT infrastructure, we've also worked with local water users and municipalities to create additional water infrastructure, such as those that are listed here. And this is just a really quick overview of Northern Water's district boundaries. As you can see, I think you can see my arrow. It extends from the Front Range all the way to eastern Colorado, clear out in Sedgwick County. And then this is a map of our collection and distribution system. So nearly all of the Colorado Big Thompson project water comes from snowmelt over here in the upper Colorado River Basin in Rocky Mountain National Park and Grand County. So snowmelt is collected and stored in Lake Granby, right here, as well as some water that's collected and stored in Willow Creek Reservoir. So from Lake Granby, water is lifted by a Far Pump Plant into the Granby Pump Canal, where it ends up in Shadow Mountain Reservoir and then Grand Lake. So from Grand Lake, water flows from Grand Lake into the west portal. Oh, where's my mouse? There we go. Into a 13.1 mile Alva B. Adams tunnel. So once it exits the tunnel on the east portal, it descends the Front Range mountains nearly 2,600 vertical feet and passes through 5 power plants, which you can see depicted on this map, and 4 reservoirs. Along the Front Range, the CBT water is stored in 3 terminal reservoirs here at Horsetooth Reservoir, Carter Lake, and then Boulder Reservoir. And then from those reservoirs, CBT water is distributed via canals and pipelines to irrigated farms, industries, utilities, cities, towns, and other water districts. So then this map just kind of depicts how water flows from the west slope to the east slope again. So this is Lake Granby, Shadow Mountain Reservoir, and Grand Lake. This is over on the west slope. These 3 lakes are collectively known as the 3 lakes. So during normal runoff, water flows into the 3 lakes, and from Shadow Mountain Reservoir, it actually flows down to Lake Granby and then down the Colorado River. There's also water over here in Willow Creek that flows into Lake Granby, and some water from the Windy Gap project as well. So when we are diverting water to the east slope, what happens is the Far Pump Plant at Lake Granby pumps water through the Granby Pump Canal into Shadow Mountain Reservoir. That raises the elevation of Shadow Mountain. Water flows into Grand Lake, and then it can flow into the Adams Tunnel. So now we're on the east slope. You can see here's the Adams Tunnel here. It flows through the tunnel into Lake Estes, it also brings some big Thompson River water as well, flows through the Olympus Tunnel, and then ultimately down to Carter Lake, Horsetooth Reservoir, and then down south in the Boulder Reservoir. So it also passes through a series of hydroelectric power plants and some other smaller reservoirs as well. So that's the Colorado Big Thompson project. In a nutshell, I'm going to pass it over to Amanda Simmons to talk more specifically about the town of Estes Park water.
Thanks, Kimberly. Like Kimberly mentioned, my name is Amanda Simmons. I work for Colorado Rural Water Association. I'm a source water specialist. So a lot of folks have never heard of Colorado Rural Water Association. Our mission is to work with small rural water providers to train them, help their certification, get their certifications to run their plants. We work throughout Colorado. Go ahead to the next one. There's a rural water association in every state. Like I said, if you can see, I don't know, over to the left, we do a lot of things. One of them is, like I said, operator trainings. We train the people who run the water and wastewater plants so that they can run their systems. We have circuit riders that come out into the community and offer technical assistance for water and wastewater. We do energy efficiency assessments for public utilities. And there I am at Source Water Protection. And I'm coming to you from our annual conference. So that's why I'm in a hotel room. That's who we are. That's what we do. Next slide. So what is source water assessment and protection? It's a two-phase process. I come to you from the Colorado State Health Department. And what we do is look at drinking water before it gets to treatment for communities. And what can we do through developing a source water protection plan to mitigate those concerns? Again, source water, so water before it comes to a utilities treatment. And next. So I just, this is timely because in the last couple of months, I just finished the town of Estes Park source water protection plan. So this is a voluntary process. So town of Estes Park was proactive in coming and working with Colorado Rural Water to develop this plan. We've been working on it for the past year. We've had stakeholder meetings about once a month since about May of last year. So an overview of where the town of Estes Park gets its water. There's actually 3 surface water sources. One of them is the Glacier Creek. So that's all within the Rocky Mountain National Park boundaries. That's 60% of the town of Estes Park water supply. And then CBT, Grand Lake via the tunnel to the East Portal. That's the part that Kimberly was just speaking about. That's 40%. And they also have Mary's Lake. Mary's Lake is an emergency only source. I know I was talking earlier, the lake, a lot of people think the water for Estes comes from Mary's Lake or Lake Estes, and it actually is a little bit different. So what do we do when we do source water protection plans? The state gives us a big map of where your water comes from and creates these assessment areas. You can see up in the right circled is the Glacier Creek headwaters, and then there's Mary's Lake. So when the state sent us this assessment and said, this is where the town gets their water, these are the areas you need to focus on, you can see that part of it, the majority of it, was covered by northern water. So we decided to focus our planning efforts on the Glacier Creek area. This is a final map. This is what a source water protection area looks like. You can see we have a 1,000-foot buffer on Glacier Creek and then the whole Glacier Creek watershed. The green outline is Rocky Mountain National Park boundary. So you could see that this effort takes a lot of coordination with the park, and we had Rocky Mountain National Park representatives in at every meeting kind of telling us what's going on with wildfire mitigation, invasive species treatments, their infrastructure within this area. So these stakeholder meetings really bring in professionals to chat about what's going on in this watershed and what we can do to prevent contamination of our source waters. I should say that the source water protection areas are non-regulatory. We decided to leave the western slope to Kimberly and Northern, and that is their focus area. And then we're going to tag team, and the town of Estes Park would like to focus on Glacier Creek Watershed. So what we do is we go through a series of meetings. We hear about it from a bunch of professionals in the industry, just kind of letting us know what's going on in this area, what could impact drinking water before it gets to treatment. And I found this to be interesting because, you know, we were asked to talk about how climate change affects drinking water. So after we look at these potential sources of contamination, we go through a process of identifying how important or what priority these should get. And you'll see up there at the top, wildfire gets the highest ranking. And right below that, algal blooms, two things that are directly related to changes in climate lately. At the health department, we will go through the water providers and identify best management practices or things they can do to mitigate these potential sources of contamination. So that was the source water protection planning effort at Town of Estes Park. The plan is about to be finalized, and I can share that with anybody that's interested in the whole document. I'm going to send it back to Kimberly.
Thanks, Amanda, for that discussion on Estes Park drinking water supply. So I'm just going to quickly go over the 2020 wildfire season, just because it was really unprecedented here in Colorado. As you are probably aware, there were several large wildfires that occurred in the state, burning over 600,000 total acres of land throughout Colorado. And really, to put matters into perspective, with the exception of the Hayman fire, it's right here, 4 out of the top wildfires in Colorado state history burned in 2020, with the 2 largest, the Cameron Peak Fire and the East Troublesome Fire, burning over 400,000 acres during the months of August through December. The East Troublesome Fire began on October 14th, northeast of Kremling in Grand County. Over a 4-day run, the fire grew significantly, with increases ranging from 18,000 to 87,000 acres each day between October 20th and the 23rd, and eventually crossed the Continental Divide and Rocky Mountain National Park. The fire was fueled by widespread drought, numerous dead and downed beetle-killed trees, red flag weather conditions, and poor humidity recovery. So the combination of these factors really led to unprecedented wind-driven active fire behavior with rapid spread during the night. So this is just a fire progression map that indicates the progression of the fire. The various colors are different dates of fire activity. So you can see, like, this yellow, just how big the fire ran during certain times. The fire was officially contained on November 30th, and in the end, it burned over 193,000 acres of land. The Cameron Peak Fire was equally unprecedented in its behavior. It's the largest wildfire in Colorado history, burning over 200,000 acres last fall. The majority of the fire burned in the watersheds of the Poudre River, but a portion of the fire crossed into the Big Thompson watershed as well. And we at Northern Water, we're participating and staying informed of the fire recovery efforts for the Cameron Peak Fire, which is being led by the Larimer County Office of Emergency Management. However, we are heavily engaged and really more intimately focused on East Troublesome Fire recovery efforts, just because it affected a really large majority of the Colorado Big Thompson collection system on the west slope. So this is a map of the watersheds that feed the CBT system, these kind of colorful watersheds here. And that's overlaid with the East Troublesome Fire boundary, which is this kind of brownish color. So you can see how extensive the burn was in the majority of our collection area. And then this slide just breaks down the percentages of burned to unburned areas within each major watershed of our collection system. So blue and green represent unburned or areas that are outside of the burn area. You can see that a large portion of the CBT contributing watersheds burned. So Willow Creek and Stillwater both burned about 90% of their watersheds. About 1/3 of the Colorado River burned, and then about 40% of the North Inlet watershed burned. Approximately 90% of the burn area is on federal lands, including Forest Service here in purple, National Park Service here in pink, and then BLM land in blue. Only about 17,000 acres of private lands burned. So I'm going to turn it back to Amanda now, who will talk about the impacts of wildfire on drinking water.
Okay, so like I said, our perspective from Colorado Rural Water is to kind of work with the water providers to think about how wildfire can impact your drinking water. So this is my job to educate, and this is a major, like I said, potential source of contamination that is becoming aware. I have a short video. We'll see if we can get the sound to work. Oh, we might not have sound through here, Kimber.
That falls onto the
There we
ground.
go.
So typically what you see after a fire is larger runoffs and faster runoffs, which can lead to flooding downstream because the reservoirs that are in place right now are already having a difficult time absorbing the kind of rapid snow melt and runoff scenarios that we've been seeing. When we look at the location of the present rim fire near Yosemite National Park, ever since this area got settled, and this is pretty much pertains to the entire Sierra Nevada, there's been this continual push to suppress wildfires to protect the value of property. And so the result that you see due to the suppression, you essentially see a lot more trees and a lot more dead debris on the ground that would have not been in place had it been for natural occurring wildfires. Couple the suppression of fire with the recent droughts that we've been hearing so much about in the Western United States, you essentially have a lot of fuel that can catch and create these massive blazes that we've been seeing. And when we look at the effects of this fire, there's actually both short-term effects and long-term effects. And this is not just the Yosemite fire, but most of the wildfires that we're seeing out in the Western United States right now. In the short term, the direct impact is one of actual physical damage to the infrastructure. So both to the electric grid, which can get damaged, and hence this just impedes your ability to deliver electricity right now, but as well as to the water grid. So you can damage the actual pipes and the canals that are present. You might even actually damage water quality directly right now. So when we're talking about the long-term effects of these kinds of fires, we're talking about actual impacts to the ecosystems and the watersheds that deliver water downstream to various stakeholders. There wouldn't necessarily be a water shortage, but the timing of the water delivery would be different, right? So right now, when snow falls onto the ground, it melts throughout the year to provide water downstream to various stakeholders. That said, if you remove the trees that are in place, it exposes the snow to a lot more radiation. And so that causes the snow to melt sooner. And if all of the snow melts quicker, the reservoirs, which are in place to hold a certain amount of water, essentially, can't cope with all that, so they might have to release sooner. And on top of that, if you have large rain events and the soil and the trees aren't there in place to basically buffer that water, your runoffs are quicker. So what essentially happens is you're going to get a lot more water in the springtime. The reservoirs aren't equipped to handle that, so they might have to release sooner. So you might actually see shortages in the summer that are actually a result of quicker runoff as opposed to actually having droughts. On top of that, there's possible effects for water quality, where you have debris running off from these sites. You might have increased sediment loading. You might have more nutrients washing down into the rivers, which are affecting both local watersheds in the mountains, but then also downstream watersheds in larger rivers and estuaries.
Thank you, Kimberly. I thought I showed that video to our water providers. I think it pretty well encapsulates how a wildfire in your watershed changes your drinking water supply. So I'm just going to recap kind of what that video said. Like he mentioned, obviously there are short-term impacts These are the things that are happening in real time. So damage to the above ground pipes and tanks, like he mentioned, electrical failures, which can remove electricity to a whole system, providing water for an entire community, changes in water pressure, and damages to your system that could compromise the safety of a community's water supply. So those are the short-term impacts. The longer term impacts are the ones that we focus on in terms of water quality. So like you mentioned, the big one is the mobilization of sediments, nutrients, and organic matter that comes downstream to those treatment facilities. It degrades surface water through erosion, ash deposition, increased sediment loads, and changes in nutrient runoff, nitrogen and phosphorus, that can spur algal blooms in downstream reservoirs as well. Source waters can be difficult to treat, resulting in additional costs and changes in the way that water treatment facilities treat their water so it's drinkable. And often these longer term impacts don't show until the big runoffs post wildfire in the winter or next spring. So like he mentioned, not only things that change the water, the chemistry of the water, the turbidity of the water, but also changes in the magnitude and timing of snowmelt runoff, loading, like we said, of nutrients, organic carbon into the systems, and increased turbidity. And like I said, we're hearing from water providers that are prepping for this, and they may need to change the entire way they treat their water, and also change where their water is coming from in preparation for these downstream changes post wildfire. So what do we suggest drinking water providers, not only the town of Estes Park, but any and all of the small water providers that operate systems downstream of these burned areas, because there are many of them. We tell them to expand their storage capacity, the use of pre-sediment basins, and diversify their sources. This is something that the town of Estes Park is doing, to take water from a different area post wildfire. If that watershed has burned, diversify so you can pull from somewhere else during those first spring runoffs. We talked to the water providers about being fire wise, not only around the homes in your community, but also around the infrastructure in your community. So keeping fire wise principles around your pump houses, your intake locations, the access roads to those that infrastructure that provides water. We work with water providers throughout the state to talk to them about retrofitting their pump houses with fire resistant material. So again, using those fire wise concepts and bringing that to the infrastructure that delivers wildfire. Maybe a pump house made of completely of wood in a fire prone area is not the smartest. So we offer options and different ideas for things that won't be as impacted if a fire is to come through your area. We can also help with forest thinning for these water providers. I'm sure you'll know the difference in what it looks like. There's a fire suppressed forest on the left and how that burns, and a managed forest on the right. So the spacing of the trees slows down the crown fire a little bit. So we can provide knowledge and funding to those water providers to do some forest thinning around their infrastructure locations and maybe in their watersheds. This is an example of a source water protection planning project where we did thin out the forest near some water infrastructure. This is kind of how we educate water providers. I let them know of there's so many resources to get educated on what your wildfire vulnerability is. This is the Colorado Wildfire Risk Assessment Portal. And I think on the next page, it shows community wildfire protection plans. Kimberly mentioned maybe somebody in your area, the town of Estes Park, or up there, a lot of communities have these wildfire protection plans. They talk about what your local firefighting capability is, the need for defensible space, and where and how to prioritize land management on both federal and non-federal land. This is an example of Estes Park, but just educating yourself on what's going on in terms of your wildfire risk in your community is very important. And that's what we work with the rural communities and water providers throughout the state to just increase this knowledge and help prepare on the forefront of wildfires. And I think the next slide is just a table of contents, what to expect in these wildfire and community wildfire plans. I think that is all from me.
Okay, so this is the last portion of our talk, and it's just going to turn to how we are responding and how we are working on recovery, specifically to the East Troublesome watershed. And as I said before, in the map that I showed a few slides back, our collection area, those watersheds, a really significant portion of our watersheds burned. So we are pretty heavily invested in the recovery from the East Troublesome fire. So because the East Troublesome fire, the area that it covered was so large, it crossed many jurisdictions. It will affect multiple stakeholders. So really, as you can imagine, the recovery process has presented some coordination challenges. For the East Troublesome fire, Northern Water has taken the lead on the organization of the watershed recovery side of things, which right now includes over 40 agencies and more than 150 members. We hold bi-weekly update meetings with all stakeholders, and then we have several subgroup meetings that we hold in between. Internally at Northern Water, we have anywhere between 25 and 30 staff members working on wildfire recovery efforts. The breadth of scope of this project really requires cross-functional support from many in our organizations. The support needed ranges from construction-related activities, watershed restoration, water quality monitoring, modeling and reporting, engineering and design work, managing interfaces between landowners and partner agencies, water supply planning, etc. We've organized our internal team currently by the different programs and functions and different aspects of fire recovery that Northern Water is involved in. Some programs we're deeply involved in include the NRCS Emergency Watershed Protection Program and some of our internal infrastructure and operations readiness. So I'm going to touch briefly on the NRCS Emergency Watershed Protection Program, just because that's really what I've been heavily focused in, and that's what I've been participating in the most. So the Emergency Watershed Protection Program, or EWP, is a program administered by the NRCS, the Natural Resources Conservation Service, which is a USDA agency, to protect threats to life and property caused by watershed impairments on non-federal land. So that would include private, state, or tribal lands. EWP requires a local governmental sponsor who must contribute a 25% match. And EWP funding goes towards construction of emergency treatments for protection of life and property. And in addition, EWP also provides 15% of estimated construction costs, which can be used for technical assistance, things like treatment designs and engineering and analysis. So Northern Water's board and the Grand County Board of County Commissioners both agreed to move forward with joint sponsorship of the Emergency Watershed Protection Program. We've divided our sponsorship responsibilities between our two organizations based on geographic areas. So Area A is Northern Water's area, and this includes the watersheds upstream of the CBT and Windy Gap projects. And then Grand County is responsible for Area B, which is really just the remainder of the burn area downstream. So we knew this program would require an all hands-on approach and reliance on critical partners for a successful implementation. So we, Northern Water and Grand County, entered into an MOU with the Three Lakes Watershed Association, the Middle Park Conservation District, and the River District to help implement and guide the Emergency Watershed Protection Program. In March, Grand County and Northern Water submitted damage survey reports to NRCS, which identified potential treatment strategies and estimated treatment costs for those strategies. So in general, the EWP treatment practices fall into one of these 4 categories shown on this slide. And I just want to emphasize that the treatments that were identified in the damage survey reports are still really preliminary, and we still have yet to go through design and engineering before we have actual projects implemented. But estimated costs for these EWP projects total roughly $35 million for both Area A and Area B. So as sponsors, we're responsible for providing roughly $9 million in match for these projects. All treatments identified in the damage survey reports have been approved. However, there is limited EWP funding at the national level. And because of this, funding is being released incrementally with no guarantee as of yet for full funding. So right now, NRCS has awarded $12 million to Grand County and Northern Water for projects construction, and then an additional $2.4 million for engineering and design. So funding was split between Area A and Area B. A small amount will be retained by the NRCS to cover their costs. So this incremental distribution of funds over time has made it necessary for us to proceed with a phased implementation of projects. So here's the EWP treatment practices, and this phased implementation strategy takes into account the availability of funding, as well as the timing of construction and the level of analysis and design needed for each treatment practice. So in general, practices that need a lower level, a lower degree of analysis and design and are less challenging to construct will be implemented using these first allocations of NRCS funding, while the practices that require significant more design and analysis or present a higher degree of construction challenges will be implemented using later funding allocations. However, we do intend to use a significant portion of funding from the first allocation on design and engineering for the practices that will be implemented at a later date. So these arrows here, we're trying to show kind of the flow of money. So these practices up at the top, you know, have a higher ease, less degree of design and engineering. So we'll be spending construction dollars to implement these while at the same time spending technical assistance dollars to further design these, you know, more technical projects. In addition, internally, we're working to prepare for runoff in summer monsoon seasons. We do anticipate increased debris flows into our reservoir. So we've been working with some consulting firms to design debris booms at our reservoirs. And we are actually, we'll be getting construction on, I think, 3 of them within the next week or so. So our objectives for this project include the protection of our existing infrastructure, like our dams and canals, and the ability to deliver water, and also to provide safety to our operations personnel and just the general public who recreate on the reservoirs. We're also working with a consultant to develop a sedimentation management plan. Our water resources department is looking at operations planning and other programmatic planning to prepare for things like flash flooding and other water quality considerations that Amanda talked about. Our water quality department has put together a water quality monitoring plan for additional monitoring sites and additional monitoring parameters throughout the burn area and affected areas downstream. And then all of this is coupled with public outreach to our West Slope stakeholders, as well as our allottees on the Front Range, along with partnerships with key agencies and other partners. So all of this really just to say it's been a heavy lift, and it does continue to be a heavy lift. There's, I think I said there was about 25 or 30 of us at Northern Water working on fire recovery, which really represents about 25% of our staff. We're constantly learning lessons along the way. Some of these we're still learning, some we have learned, but things like what sort of post-fire assessments take place, like what can we expect in these burn areas to occur, which agencies perform these assessments and when are they performed. What kind of funding programs are available for recovery, things like the EWP program that I just touched on. What sort of post-fire treatments are most effective and also eligible for funding? When and where can treatments be applied? You know, coordination with the landowners, federal landowners, private landowners is going to be crucial on this. Which stakeholders are really critical to be involved with fire recovery? And then also who has the capacity as well as the will to lead these recovery efforts. So this is our last slide. I think Amanda and I just wanted to stress to you all how important partnerships are, as well as local support when it comes to fire recovery and protection of drinking water sources in general. So you in your community, you can help by staying involved in your local source water protection efforts, as well as supporting additional source water protection or other forest health efforts, whether it's through attending meetings such as these to keep informed of local issues, supporting local coalitions like the Estes Valley Watershed Coalition, as well as the town of Estes Park, who are already doing things to protect the watersheds in your own backyard. And you know, other things like supporting policies that may benefit source water protection and forest health issues. So we at Northern Water, the town of Estes Park, most local communities, we don't own the majority of the land that supplies our water. And we're really grateful for the partnerships that we have both on the west and the east slope. And just want to end that collaboration between our partners is really necessary, as we all do have a common goal of restoring and protecting the collective watersheds. So just want to end by saying thank you so much for your time. Really grateful for the opportunity to be here, and here's our contact information if you want to reach out to us for any questions. Amanda, any other follow-up thoughts?
No, great job, Kimberly. I saw a question pop up, however.
Yep, go ahead. I think the question, and I'll go ahead and I'll read a couple questions. I actually have a few that were submitted ahead of time as well. So the question is, can you discuss the new project, the Chimney Howell project on the West Slope?
Yeah, I can briefly discuss it, although I will say that I have not been involved in the Chimney Hollow project, so I don't know that I'm the best person to discuss these. I do know that it's a project that involves bringing additional supplemental water over from the Windy Gap. It's the Windy Gap project. It brings water from the Colorado River, utilizing the Three Lakes, the CBT infrastructure, over to the Front Range. We just settled a lawsuit yesterday, which I think everyone's really excited about, which means that construction, I think it's been, you know, this project has been identified for about 20 years and we've been planning for it for about 20 years. So that construction will begin probably, I don't know, this summer. I'm actually not sure. So I don't want to speak out of turn, but I think with the lawsuit settling, the project will actually advance. The Chimney Hollow reservoir will, that's what we mean when we talk about construction, that a new reservoir is being built just west of Carter Lake in Loveland.
Okay, thank you.
Hopefully that answered your questions. And if anyone, Rachel, if you have additional follow-up, I can send you to the right people who have been working really hard on this.
Great. Another question here is related to the 2020 fire, and what percentage of Estes Park's water source do you think has been impacted? And early on in the presentation, you noted that 60% of our water here in Estes Park that we consume comes from Glacier Creek and 40% from the East Portal. So just out of curiosity, what percent of our water source do you think has been impacted by the fires?
Amanda, do you want to touch on that one? Since you just completed their plan.
I'm on mute. So luckily the fire that burned near the East Troublesome, that burned up to Estes Park, the town was lucky in that it did not burn the Glacier Creek watershed. So they are going to receive impacts from, the water that comes down the CBT, but they are diversified in that they take water from either the Glacier Creek watershed or majorly the CBT system. So they're going to switch over to Glacier Creek watershed and hopefully monitor some of the impacts of the water that's coming through the tunnel. Does that answer that question?
I think it does. I think it does. And while we're talking about the tunnel, Jeff has a question. You said Mary's Lake is an emergency water source only. How is Mary's Lake connected to the East Portal, and what tunnels are involved? And I think that you had a map earlier that showed them in very, very tiny print, but maybe you can talk to them.
Kimberly is kind of the infrastructure expert here, but you are correct. The CBT water comes to the East Portal and then down to Mary's Lake. There's also a Mary's Lake treatment facility right there. The Mary's Lake treatment facility treats water from the Glacier Creek watershed and also has that emergency intake there. Kimberly, do you know the specifics on what the tunnel name is? I could find out, but that would not be.
I should know, and I could find out here. If Jeff would like to provide his contact information, I can follow up with that for sure.
And Jeff, does that answer your question somewhat?
Yeah, I was just curious about how those actually, is there a tunnel that goes from the East Portal over to Mary's Lake? That was the main thing I was curious about.
Yes, sir.
Okay. All right, thanks.
Yeah. And Jeff, if you live here in Estes, if you take Route 66 past the Y, you'll end up to the East Portal campsite, and there'll be some exposed water over there. And that is actually the water. It's kind of like and correct me if I'm wrong, Kimberly and Amanda, but that is the water that's come over from Grand Lake and through the tunnel, through the divide. And that's the first exposed area before it goes to another tunnel through Ramshorn Mountain into Mary's Lake. And so we as Estes Park pull our water out of portion of that. 40% of our water consumption is pulled from that tunnel.
Mm-hmm. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, not too many people know about that. And it's, I think, a misnomer. A lot of people think that we as Estes Park pull our water from Mary's Lake or Lake Estes. And so it's one of those little factoids that everybody should have in their back pocket during those parties. You can pull it out and sound impressive.
Excellent. Yes, so mainly within park boundaries at Glacier Creek. And I should say that the result of that source water protection planning effort, it looks like it's going to be a coordination with Rocky Mountain National Park to maybe address some of the over visitation that the park sees, and within that watershed, maybe teaming up with them to install an additional waste station, like a vault toilet, because obviously they have a lot of visitation to the park and within that watershed. So those are the small things that we can do for communities to help.
Just as a follow-up question, in terms of what you said, Amanda, that Estes Park will be switching over to the Glacier Creek source water for us while we're having a lot of snow melt. So what does that actually mean with the East Portal water going into Mary's Lake and then eventually going into Lake Estes? Will there happen to be some type of treatment or filtering or debris monitoring for that water source? And if so, will we see a lot more activity around those two lakes, equipment, or is it all going to be naked to the eye, or unseen to the eye, I should say, happening behind the scenes?
That's a great question. I'm not sure that we know yet. I think sounds like, and Kimberly can piggyback this one, it sounds like the majority of the on the ground things are going to take place over on the western slope in those burned areas. So maybe more over in Grand Lake before the water gets to Estes. But I do know that the water quality analysts at Town of Estes Park are participating in all of these post-fire recovery efforts. And they are involved and in tune and ready to respond as best they can.
Yeah, and along those lines too, our water quality department had some water users meetings with municipalities, and I know Estes Park participated as well, and they put out some surveys to water users, like what are the parameters that you like, your critical parameters that you cannot accept water. What are you most concerned with when it comes to monitoring? So we're working with those water users as well to help hopefully address those concerns, or at least keep an eye on them. I know Estes Park they're kind of the first on the list when it comes into the Continental Divide or crosses the Continental Divide. So they're kind of they'll be on the lookout.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. We have another question in the chat. Can you talk a little bit about the Upper Colorado River drought plan's effect on the water this year? I know before the session today, I asked Amanda if she knew any details about that. So it looks like that Lillian had the same question as well. We've been operating in a little bit of a drought, and I know that in the Front Range, they've been preparing for droughts as well. Do you see us being impacted at all here in Estes Park or along the Front Range? As
far as water supply,
drought plans that are affected.
I am unfortunately, I'm not very familiar with the drought plan, so I don't know that I can speak to how this affects our water this year. I know that our water resources department has been working really hard with the Bureau to make sure that we have enough water. I know there's plenty of storage. I think the reservoirs are full for this year, and we're talking, they're doing those operational planning now to predict. So.
Okay, excellent. Well, I definitely know with all the snow that we've been getting in the last week, we're helping with the snowpack. So hopefully those reservoirs will stay a little fuller this year. So we can only hope. Are there any other questions for Kimberly or Amanda? And we can unmute and ask those questions, or just drop them into the chat field. And while we are waiting for any last minute discussions here, I'm just going to throw this back up there for those of you who, who may have not seen this at the beginning of the session, but just as a reminder, Estes Valley Watershed Coalition and the Wandering Wildlife Society, we're really focused on water conservation, especially during the month of April, since today is Earth Day. But we're also focused on healthy wildlife as well. And just as a teaser, our next presentation is going to be butterfly gardening, and that's going to be on May 13th from noon to 1. And we're going to be talking a lot about what we can do to make our environment up here habitable for the butterflies, and of course, all those other birds and other insects that love those. So just a little plug out there. And also, if I can just put one more plug in there, we are having a wonderful duck race sponsored by the Rotary up here, the Estes Park Rotary. So this year, the annual duck race will occur on May 1st. Please, please, please support your only local watershed, which is the Estes Valley Watershed Coalition, and buy a duck or two, or adopt a duck or two, maybe a flock, and maybe you'll get some really cool prizes from those duck drawings. So they're going to be swing around the lazy river a couple times before they pick a couple ducks out for the winning prizes. So just had to throw that in there. Any last questions for Kimberly or Amanda? All right. Fantastic. Kimberly, Amanda, thank you so much for being a part of our Earth Day celebration, part of our Earth Month celebration on water conservation and everything to do with water. So it was very informative. I learned a few things as well. So appreciate all the information. And I know that we have several people that did not make it today because of most likely the weather up here. It's snowing. But we did record this session and we will be sure to get that out to all of those that could not make it today. So thanks again. Appreciate your constant support of the Estes Valley Watershed Coalition here in Estes Park.
Thank you.
Thanks,
All right.
Dawn. Thanks,
Thanks.
everyone.
Take care. Bye-bye.